or maybe here for the first time, welcome. This is Subversive Preacher. My name is Cameron Miller, and it's the second Sunday of Lent. This is a different kind of sermon than I usually do. I'm not sure if anybody will appreciate it, but it's what kind of emerged. Anyway, I get started today by telling you that I do not know anything, that you have as much idea about what's going on in this story from Mark, or the one from Genesis for that matter, as I do. But here's what I think. And aren't you glad you asked? Mark wrote this. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and that he would be rejected by the Jewish elders and the leading priests and the teachers of the law. He told them that the Son of Man must be killed and then rise from the dead after 3 days. Jesus told them this plainly. He told them what happened. Now, that is Mark and Mark's community inserting in this story something about Jesus being aware ahead of time of what was going to happen to him, crucifixion. And Mark is doing it to kind of buck up and embolden followers of Jesus, terrified by the scorched earth policy that Rome had inflicted upon Judea and Galilee in the 3-year war of 66 to 70 CE. It is always important for us to remember when we are listening to the Gospels or reading the Gospel stories that what we're hearing is not a verbatim transcript of what actually happened in history told by witnesses who were there. What we have, rather, is the result of Mark and his community slowly and intentionally editing the stories and the sayings and inserting them into a narrative of their own creation, and painstakingly putting it all down on precious pieces of parchment and papyrus fashioned into a scroll. And it was done not necessarily by someone named Mark, but by a community of Jesus followers under the banner of the name Mark, about whom we know very little. Now, New Testament scholars debate when and where Mark was written, but the earliest say that it was between 50 and 60 of the Common Era, contemporary with when Paul was writing. Others say it was 60 to 70 during or just after the Jewish-Roman War that ended in 70. Most theorize it was written from Rome for an audience of Gentiles. Now, the whys and the wherefores of all these theories are interesting but not really useful for today. What I want us to remember is that Mark was an editor as much, if not more, than an author. He and his companions had collected and had received lots and lots of stories and sayings and parables, but they received them without a context. They had to decide when Jesus said a particular thing, and to whom, and to where, and why. They probably are not making up the stories or the sayings, but they are making up a narrative context for them. They have received these bits and pieces across 25 to 45 years of time and across 2,200 geographical miles and through however many cultures and languages those bits and pieces were passed. They knew how the story ended in Mark with an empty tomb. And they knew how the story began in Mark with a baptism. Where did everything else, all those other bits and pieces, where did they fit in? So what we have are gems of wisdom, some of which are very likely authentic Jesus sayings and very early stories about him, fitted into a narrative glue of Mark's creation that holds them all together. And how Mark tells his story is with intentional bias. It's told to tell us that what Mark thinks is important for us to know about Jesus. What we heard today or read today is a literary feature of Mark. What it's going to tell us is that Jesus knew what was about to happen before it happened, and then he told people what was going to happen. But we must ask ourselves, from our perspective here in the 21st century, did Jesus really know what was going to happen? Did he really know he was going to be arrested and crucified? Do human beings know in advance what will happen to them? We might have some ideas, usually vague, and I don't know if you're like me, often mistaken. So we might ask, why would Mark want his audience to believe that Jesus knew what was going to happen to him ahead of time? Because they wanted their audience to believe that it was God that had done it. For some reason, God must have wanted Jesus to be crucified. Otherwise, and they're thinking, how could it happen that way? There's no way to explain it, they thought. God must have made it happen, or else at least let it unfold the way it did, and for a reason. Now, we tend to think of Rome, where Mark and his community were working on this, as a stable place, whereas Judah and Galilee were a chaotic push and pull of imperial power over a population that didn't want foreign domination. But Rome itself was actually chaotic. For example, during 1 year, 69 CE, which may have been a year in which Mark was written, 3 different emperors ascended the throne, and all 3 of them were killed by a 4th in 1 year. If Mark is writing in the midst of the kind of Rome that felt like chaos on the verge of apocalypse, then we can imagine how important it would have been to his audience to know that Jesus suffered death on the cross, knowing full well that he was choosing it, and that anyone who follows him must do the same. Think about it. What meaning would it have had for Jesus to say, "Pick up your cross and follow me," if he hadn't been crucified yet? Clearly, that's a kind of a saying placed on the lips of Jesus after he was already dead, one that was meant to encourage faithful commitment against all odds. So like I said, I think today's story is a story told in retrospect, told after the crucifixion, as an effort to make sense of a Messiah being executed by Rome. Think about this now. Mark and his community find meaning in the idea that God caused Jesus to suffer horribly at the hands of state authority. For Mark and his colleagues, God causing Jesus' execution is what made sense of it. Maybe that doesn't make sense for us, but that made sense to him. And you see, the storytellers tell the story in a way that makes sense to them, just like it does when we tell stories. Another intentional literary device in this story is Peter's objection. In Mark, as I've mentioned before, one of the literary features he uses is that people who are supposed to be the good guys, the disciples, members of his family, fellow Jews and contemporaries who share a faith and a covenant, all those people who are supposed to be good guys are precisely the people in Mark's narrative who don't recognize Jesus for who or what he was. But the bad guys, demons, Satan, Roman soldiers, and Gentiles, now they're the ones who do recognize Jesus for who and what he was. It's a literary device. And perhaps if Mark was indeed written in Rome, this is a way of saying to the audience in Rome, to Gentiles, you didn't have to be there, and you didn't have to be one of them in order for you to recognize Jesus, who and what he is now. Now, the way that this story from Mark relates to Genesis, which was written so many centuries earlier, and the story of Abram and Sarah, or sorry, is that Genesis is a book of stories written after the fact too. It wasn't written till the Exodus was over and Israel had become a kingdom, and then through a civil war had become two kingdoms, and Genesis was then finally written. So most likely it was also, like Mark, edited. In other words, a collection of stories that had been told for generations, put together in one collection with a purpose. And the purpose of Genesis was to answer questions. What happened before? What happened before the burning bush? What happened before Moses? Where did Moses come from? Where did we come from? How did God make all that happen? How did God make us a people? How even did God make the heaven and the earth? Genesis answers questions that were asked afterwards. After they were already a people, already a culture, already had a history. Genesis is a prequel or a prehistory. That's the way we always tell stories about our families and other people. We tell them in retrospect, and we explain gaps in the story with more stories. Now, does all this mean that Mark and Genesis are not true? Not at all. It means that they hold truth. And the fact that they held truth was the stories were what preserved and carried that truth across time and distance. But we must not confuse the vessel, the stories, with the truths that they carry. There may be a lot of truths held in these stories we heard today, but one clear and simple one that I recognize is this. Whenever we commit ourselves to radical acts of love, we may be in danger. Those who want dominion and those who amass fortunes, they work hard to discredit and to reject and to even destroy those who seek justice through peace. Now that may not be enough truth for those who want to make unique and universal claims about Jesus. But the truth that we are in danger when we commit ourselves to radical acts of love, well, that's a big enough truth for me. Thanks for being here. I wish you peace.